Welcome to another lesson on Lunch with the Lord. I'm Pastor Mark. We're continuing our series of lessons here in the letter of Paul to the Galatians. We're looking at Galatians chapter 5, verse 11. But before we begin, our theme verse for Lunch with the Lord, Jeremiah 15:16. Thy words were found, and I did eat them, and thy word was unto me the joy and rejoicing of my heart. Now, Paul here says in verse 11, And I, brethren, if I yet preach circumcision, why do I yet suffer persecution? Then is the offense of the cross ceased. Now, Paul here says, if I yet preach circumcision, and there are several opinions concerning this phrase, if I yet preach circumcision. And one opinion is this. In Acts chapter 16 and in verse 3, Paul chooses Timothy to go with him on their missionary journey. So Timothy wants to go. He gets saved. He wants to go with Paul. And Paul here circumcises Timothy right away, okay, before they leave. Now, is Paul contradicting himself? And we have to say no, because Timothy was circumcised because he was a half Jew, and Paul wanted to take away the reproach against him that may come from the Jews. So here's Timothy. Timothy is half Jew, half Gentile. His father was a Greek, his mother was a Jew, his grandmother was Jewish also. And Paul, knowing that they are going to be going to synagogues and to Jewish areas in their future missionary journeys, Paul said that he said to himself that he didn't want this to be a stumbling block for Timothy. He wanted Timothy to be able to have an avenue with the Jewish people to preach the word of God. Timothy wasn't circumcised, so Paul took him and circumcised him. And it had nothing to do with Paul thinking that circumcision was necessary for salvation or necessary for a better life, okay, with God. Paul did this specifically and mainly so that it would take away Timothy's reproach from the Jews, all right, so that he would have an avenue to preach the word of God to the Jewish people. In 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 20, Paul states that, Unto the Jews I became a Jew, that I might gain the Jews. And after Paul was saved, there was no way that Paul was going to preach that circumcision was necessary for salvation, or that it benefited any man in any way towards God. Paul knew what salvation was. Paul knew all the essence of salvation, and Paul was not going to say now that circumcision was needed for salvation. He just wouldn't do that, okay? Paul said, Unto the Jews I became a Jew. Why did he become a Jew? He became a Jew so that he could preach the gospel of grace to them, to have an avenue to preach the word of God so that Jews would be saved, so that they would accept him and hear the word of God from him. It reminds me of Hudson Taylor. I remember reading a book about Hudson Taylor, and when he went to China, one of the things that he did after he was there, he realized that he wasn't reaching the Chinese like he should. So what he did was he went way outside the box, and he did what these other missionaries would not do, and he became a Chinaman. He dyed his hair. He wore the clothes. He would not submit himself to what the general populace of the missionaries would do, because missionaries in those days, in Hudson Taylor's days, would go to China or they would go to a country, but they would bring their own culture. They would dress with their own clothes. They would speak with their own language, and of course they would learn the language. But with Hudson Taylor, he made it an absolute point that he wanted to look like a Chinese man. He wanted to dress like a Chinese man. He wanted to speak and walk like a Chinaman. Why? Because would that save him? No. But what it would do is it would bring down many barriers within the Chinese so that they would accept him and hear the word of God from him. And he had tremendous results with that. And it was a while later where finally the missionary board that he was associated with and the missionaries that were around him, who first mocked him and laughed at him, then they began to see the results and they began to do it also. And this is what Paul is saying. To the Jews I became a Jew. Why? So that I could win them. And that's what he was doing with Timothy. Timothy was half Jew, but he was making him circumcised so that he could have an avenue to preach the gospel to the Jews. Another opinion on this is that obviously before Paul was saved, he preached circumcision. Okay? Paul was a very strict Pharisee. Let's go back to Philippians. Philippians chapter 3, verses 4 through 7 says, "Though I might also have confidence in the flesh, if any other man thinks that he has whereof he might trust in the flesh, I have more. Circumcised on the 8th day, of the stock of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of the Hebrews, as touching the law I was a Pharisee. Concerning zeal I persecuted the church. Touching the righteousness which is in the law," Paul said, "I was blameless. But what things were gained to me, those I counted loss for Christ." Paul, you couldn't get more Jewish than Paul was. And before Paul became saved, I'm sure he did preach circumcision. He did preach a relationship to God through circumcision, that it was absolutely necessary. Okay? But in Paul's past life, he did preach circumcision and he did perform circumcision on Timothy, but Paul never preached that circumcision was necessary after he got saved. After Paul got saved, he would never preach that circumcision was necessary or that circumcision was needed for any kind of beneficial life with God, because he knew the truth. He knew that. All right? So he says here, "And I, brethren, if I still preach circumcision, why do I yet suffer persecution?" Okay? "Then is the offense of the cross ceased." And he says, if I yet suffer persecution, the fact that Paul was being persecuted by the Jews is a testimony that Paul did not teach Jew or Gentile the necessity of being circumcised, okay? Because if he did teach that, then there would be no persecution. So the simple fact that Paul was being persecuted was a testimony that Paul did not preach circumcision amongst Jews or Gentiles. He did not preach it as a form of righteousness or right standing with God. So here he says, why do I yet suffer persecution? If I'm still preaching circumcision, then why am I still suffering persecution? And then he says, then is the offense of the cross ceased. And, you know, the cross is the root of all of Paul's and our persecution. If Paul preached circumcision as a necessity for salvation, then the cross becomes of no effect, okay? And remember, if anyone could be saved by doing something, helping an old lady across the street, becoming circumcised, giving your money to the poor, helping out children or whatever, if you could do something and be saved, then whatever that may be that you could do, then Jesus died for nothing, and he shed his blood on the cross for nothing. Why? Because all I have to do is to do that thing, and I'm saved. I don't need Jesus. I don't need his blood. I don't need the cross. It was at the cross that Jesus fulfilled the whole law and then nailed it to the cross and took it out of the way. Okay, Colossians chapter 2, verse 14, I've quoted it many times. Jesus took the law and nailed it to the cross and took it out of the way. All right? The preaching of the cross is an offense to the Jews, because if people can be saved by simply having faith in what Jesus did for them on the cross, then the law becomes useless. The preaching of the cross offends the Jews because it takes away the law. It takes away any doing of the law for a righteousness with God. And also, the cross is foolishness. It's offensive to the Gentiles. Why? Because the cross testifies that no amount of good works can save us. No other belief system, no humanistic thought, no evolutionary pursuit is of any value to your eternal destiny. So the cross is an offense to the Jews. It's an offense to the Gentiles. The cross offends everybody. It's an offense to everyone. The whole problem that the world has with Christianity, the whole problem that people have with you at work, wherever, at school, wherever you go, the whole problem that people have with you and with Christianity is absolutely focused on one thing, and it's focused on the cross. The cross. That's it, where the blood was shed to pay for our salvation, to redeem us, to redeem us from our sinful nature. And it's the cross. Paul said, "And I, brethren, if I preach circumcision, why am I still persecuted? Then is the offense of the cross ceased." And you know what? The problem is that there will never be a day when the offense of the cross will cease, as long as until Christ comes. Until Jesus Christ comes again, there will always be an offense to the cross. Why? Because that's where the enemy was defeated. That's where his death knell was sounded, at the cross. The cross is the symbol of our enemy's defeat, and he hates the cross, and he hates the blood. Why? The cross defeated him. The blood saves you and me. The cross, what? The cross defeated him, and the blood is able to save you and me. That's why he hates the cross, and that's why there's an offense to the cross. All right? Have a great day. Until then, walk with the Lord. I know he walks with you.